I'm Lisa from Pink Holly Bush Designs, and welcome back to Make Your Daughter a Dress. This is lesson 5. So I hope that you have your bodice all put together, and today we are going to go ahead and finish up this neckline. So let's get started. So I'm here with the bodice lining, and I've gone ahead and at the ironing board I've pressed up a 1/2 inch, that seam allowance, on both bodice backs and on the bodice front, and I've pressed it, you can see here, to the wrong side. Okay, get this. Now on the bodice backs, at this center back point, I'm going to take my purple marking pen and I'm just going to make a dot. I'm going to unfold that 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'm making a dot a 1/2 inch from the back, the center back edge, raw edge. I'm going to do that on both sides. Okay, and I'm going to pin together this center back all the way around the neckline and back down the center back. And I'm going to start by matching up the shoulder seams. And also that center front. Remember, we notched both pieces of the lining fabric and the fashion fabric, and that's so we could line that up. And I'm also putting the heads of the pins out towards the neckline, and you'll see why I'm doing that in just a minute. Right, you can see I have everything all pinned. Now notice that when I pinned the bottom of the back bodice, I unfolded that seam allowance and pinned it flat. Now, if you didn't do any embellishments on the neckline, you're all set to go over to your sewing machine and sew the neckline at this point. You're going to sew from this purple dot down around the neckline, pivot here, and back down to this purple dot. Okay. If it would help to mark the pivot point, make another purple dot. It'll be a 1/2 inch in from the side back and a 1/2 inch down from the neckline. Okay, and do one at both sides. If you did any kind of embellishment, then you want to sew with the fashion fabric facing up. And the reason for that is, if you remember when you were putting on those embellishments, I said in the video, sew slowly and be accurate. You're making a guideline for yourself. And your guideline, it might be hard, I hope you can see it, is this stitching line. And I have several because I put both the piping and the scalloped edging on. You might only have one if you only put on one embellishment. So the guideline that I'm going to follow is the one that's the farthest away from the neckline. That's the one that's actually right up against that piping. So again, I'm going to want to start down here, go up, pivot, go around following that guideline, pivot, and go back down. But now to make sure that I know where to pivot, we're going to take a pin, and I'm just going to transfer that purple dot I made to the back so I can see it. And while I could just measure, I just find it helpful if I do it this way. I'm making sure I'm lining right up with where I ironed that 1/2 inch. Okay. Now I'm also going to back tack at each of those purple dots. Okay, I have put my needle right down into that purple dot. I'm sewing with actually my open toe foot, which is kind of might be a strange foot for you, but on the Bernina, this actually has a groove in the bottom of it, so that will go over that piping. You can use your piping foot if you put piping on. If you put a ruffle on, just use your regular foot to, your all-purpose foot to sew this. If you use the edging or the piping, you might find that your all-purpose foot does a better job. But the goal is to follow that line at the top. As long as you can see that line and you can stitch right on that sewing line, your stitching will not show when we're done. So as I said, I'm going to back tack, but making sure I am right, started right at that purple dot and didn't go all the way back to the bottom edge. And I'm just going to show you the pivot. So I've come up right to my previous line of stitching. I've put my needle down. I'm going to lift my presser foot, swing the fabric around, put it down, and now I'm going to follow that line of previous stitching. Okay, so now I've stitched from the dot around and back down to the dot. So what I want to do at this point is open it up and just make sure everything's okay. You know, that I didn't get any folds in there. Everything's flat. I didn't stitch through the piping or the edging. Okay, and it looks good to me. There don't seem to be any problems. So once you know there aren't, and remember, if there are, just get your seam ripper and take out where the problem section is and restitch it. Okay, so at this point what we're going to do is trim. So I'm going to start by cutting off these corners diagonally. So I want to trim the seam allowances to a scant 1/4 of an inch. So with the corners now off, I'm just going to trim down. And I'm going to go all around the neck, doing the same thing. Now when you go around the neck, you should not be cutting off that original stay stitching that we did. At 1/3 of an inch. That should still be staying in there. But you should be getting very close to it. Once I've trimmed it down to that 1/4 inch, I also want to make several notch cuts, just because when you turn it, that's going to allow it to spread and lie flat. And you want to actually take these out of where there's the most curve. And all of this that I'm doing right now is just really about reducing bulk. And as I'm doing some of these notches, I am taking, I am cutting into that stay stitching that we did at 1/3. So don't worry about doing that. That's more important right now that you get that bulk out. You also can make just some straight slits, but actually doing a notch helps because you're just removing material. I have a lot of bulk in my seam because I did those 2 different edgings. So I'm actually going to do what's called grading this seam allowance, and so I'm going in on this lining side and I'm trimming this even a little bit closer. Actually, I'm sorry, that's not the lining side, it's the fashion fabric side. All right, I'm back at the ironing board because this is really the key to getting your neckline to look good. So we're going to be using our other essential tool, the iron. So I'm starting out by just, as always, pressing everything just flat. Okay. And then we're going to turn it right sides out. And you want to really make sure you get that corner turn. So I'm going to use an orange stick, the non-pointing end. You can use a pencil. If you didn't use any embellishments, you've got a really, straight corner there to turn. You could get a pin in from the outside, pull that corner out a little bit, but you really want to get it so you've got it pulled out as much as possible. And if you're finding as you do this that something doesn't want to lay flat, or like I might find there's too much bulk right here, turn it back, go back in and trim some more. Okay. Now we're going to press again, but this time you want to press from the lining side. If you don't have any embellishment, you can see that the edging actually is going to help me keep this lining to the wrong side where I want it. But if you don't have that, like here on the side, what you want to do is you want to be pressing kind of right on that seam, but you want to, with your fingers, slightly roll the lining to the wrong side so that just a tiny smidgen of the fashion fabric shows. Maybe you can see that, okay? Because I obviously don't want the lining to show from the right side. And you would do what I just did there all around this neckline if you don't have edging like I do, or piping, which is kind of going to make it clear which is where separates the lining and the fashion fabric. So then you're just going to work it around with that iron and pull it, and you want to just keep working till you get it beautifully smooth. Do that over here again. And now, as I said, if this right here in this neckline, if that doesn't want to lie nice and flat for me, then turn it wrong side out again, go in there and do a little bit more trimming with the scissors. And then turn it right side over, give it a press, Make sure you are just really happy with how it's lying there and what it's doing. Because if you don't get it lying flat and beautiful now, you're not going to be able to do it later. And you can always use that bottle of water to give you a little hand to make everything nice and flat. I do have a little bit of lumpiness right there, so I might go back in and trim a little bit more. Our last step in finishing the neckline is going to be to understitch it, and I just want to show you the purpose of that. If you have a neckline like this little July flowers where there's no embellishment at all, you want to make sure that you don't see that lining from the right side. And as you can see here, you don't on this dress. Well, it's understitching that keeps that from happening. So if you look on the lining side, you'll see that there is this line of stitching. And we're actually going to stitch the lining to the seam allowance, and that's what keeps everything here on the wrong side. So let me show you how to do that. Okay, I'm going to take my beautifully pressed bodice and turn it back, wrong sides out. And I'm going to start at center front. And you can just use your regular foot, or I'm using an open toe just because it lets me really see what's going on. And I'm going to sew using a straight stitch from center front as far as I can towards the back edge. And I'm sewing that seam allowance to the lining. And I'm going to just kind of pull on both the fashion fabric on the left and the lining on the right to keep everything straight, and so I don't get anything wrinkled or under my presser foot. I'm stitching, back tacking, and just going around. Make sure you keep the pieces separate. But as you go into that curve, that's where you really kind of need to keep a little tension on that fabric. And you're going to see what's going to happen here is I'm going to get to a point where I can't go any farther because I'm getting too close to the corner. And there, I'm there. And so I'm just going to back, forward and back, clip my threads. And I'm going to do the exact same thing from the other side. What did I just, okay. Well, so let me show you mistakes happen. And I caught my, my edging in there as I did. So I'm going to get my seam ripper and take that stretch out. So learn from my mistake and make sure that you keep the edging towards the fashion fabric side as you do this. Once you've done the one side, you go back to the center front and you're going to do the same thing. Just going to the other side as far as you can, and again kind of keeping some of that tension so that it all is straight. And if you look at the wrong side, some threads I have to clip, you'll see there's that line of stitching, and that's holding that lining down, so it's not going to pop up and show on the right side. So that is all you have to do for today. That finishes the bodice neckline. I'll be back in the next lesson and we will get these armholes finished. So if you have any questions, just let me know. But otherwise, go ahead and finish your neckline and happy sewing.